Benim adım Cafer, ben Kırım Tatarım. My name is Jaffa and I'm a Crimean Tatar. We don't actually use the word Crimean Tatar that much because we are indigenous people of Crimea, so it's easier to say Crimean or Kırımlı.
Новых субъектов Федерации, Республики Крым и города Севастополь.
2014 is the moment that sort of divided the history of Crimea into before and after.
When Kiev turned towards Europe, Moscow was worried it might lose access to this strategically significant piece of land on the Black Sea. And really this laid the groundwork designed to insert Russia's sovereignty over that land.
There was virtually no bloodshed when Crimea was annexed, mainly because the Ukrainian government was in shambles at the time. The Ukrainian military was unable to mount any kind of serious resistance.
In Moscow at the time, I saw slogans on the street saying Krym nash, Crimea is ours. It was very much the idea that this is just a correction of a historical injustice. This was Crimea coming home to its motherland.
Back in 2014, few could have predicted that Crimea would only be the starting point of Russia's attempt to conquer Ukraine. But far from remaining a one-off land grab, Crimea was subsequently followed by the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which went partially under Moscow's control. After the full-scale invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions too are now being held by Russia. Critics often use the word Russify to describe the forced integration of the local population. In this series of The Global Jigsaw, we explore some of the methods the Kremlin employs in its efforts to erase the Ukrainian identity of occupied lands. We ask how hard would it be to reverse the process? First, under the magnifying glass goes Crimea. I'm Krasi Twig, and this is The Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring, where we look at the world through the lens of its media, getting past the narratives, the propaganda and the disinformation.
Радио Tehran. Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
조중 두당 두 나라 최고 영도자 동지들께서는
Until 2014, Crimea was an undisputed part of Ukraine, even though it had a complicated history and its population spoke mainly Russian. The peninsula on the Black Sea, once part of the Soviet Union, has a special place in Russian hearts. Our guides to this contested region are two colleagues who spent their childhood there. Here's Jafer Umerov from the BBC's Ukrainian service.
I was born in an independent country, fairly democratic. We were just three Europeans trying to build our future there.
That country was Ukraine.
Yeah.
What was your identity? What did you grow up as?
Yeah, I mean, we all have this self-identity crisis, I think, but I identify myself as a Ukrainian citizen, but ethnically I'm Crimean.
And you are the only Crimean Tatar in the BBC?
Well, yeah, I'm the only one here.
So your ethnicity is clear, it's Crimean Tatar.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, how Ukrainian did you feel? And did you ask yourself, why are we speaking in Russian?
I actually did. I was growing up in Ukraine. I've never lived in Soviet Union. I've never been in Russia. And for me, my country is Ukraine. I questioned myself, why do we actually speak Russian? As a kid, for me, obviously I didn't know the historical aspect back then, but we never saw ourselves as Russians. Crimea has always been a melting pot of cultures. Armenians, Georgians, Germans, Koreans, Bulgarians, and Ukrainians, Russians. But now it is mostly considered Russian.
Yana Lushnevskaya from BBC Monitoring's Kyiv team also remembers those days with fondness. Her childhood impressions, too, are from post-Soviet independent Ukraine.
In the 1990s and 2000s, Crimea was much less isolated than it is now. It was just a usual Ukrainian region. You could take the train from Simferopol, the capital of Crimea, to Kiev or Kharkiv or Lviv. You could go to Moscow, of course. So much more of the world was open to you, and I cannot imagine growing up without that. I had a lot of pro-Russian teachers, nostalgic for the Soviet Union, but I also had a lot of access to alternative information. I could go on exchange programs. Currently, Crimea is very isolated, both geographically and mentally.
There are hints in what Jana said about Crimea's closeness to Moscow. Jen Monaghan, who watches Russian media for BBC Monitoring, has the Russian perspective.
Moscow has always seen Ukraine as being within its sphere of influence. More than that, Russia has a significant military presence in Crimea. Going back to the 1700s, it's a strategic location on the Black Sea. From there, ships can access the Mediterranean and from there out into Africa.
Going further back, Crimea was part of the Ottoman Empire and was its own country at one point, making money off the slave trade. Crimea has the strategic location of a warm water port, offering a shortcut to the world. And there are other reasons for its allure.
During the Soviet Union, it was a destination for holidaymakers. Children went to summer camps on the peninsula.
В Крыму десятки детских санаториев и пионерских лагерей.
It's got a warm spot in many Russians' hearts.
But there is a dark side to this socialist holiday paradise. While citizens of the Soviet Union went south to enjoy the sun and the sea, the region's indigenous population was living in exile, far away from their homeland.
In 1944, the Soviet Union mass deported Crimean Tatars from their homeland. My family ended up in Uzbekistan. That's where my parents also were born. Then they moved back to Crimea in 1989.
Their homeland just happened to be very attractive to the Russians. As somebody who grew up on the Black Sea, I can confirm it's a lovely place to be.
It is indeed very beautiful. The climate is mild. When the Russian Empire got Crimea, it has become a destination for holidays, also during the Soviet Union.
Южный берег Крыма. Один из крупнейших курортных районов Советского Союза.
Which is nice, but also sad for the local population that was moved away from Crimea and they weren't allowed to go there. My grandparents, they were moved away from their homes when they were children. They left any possessions they had, but they were moved to Central Asia. They were just left in the field with no food, nothing. Lots of people died while getting there. It was just train for animals. And the journey took around 20 days. I think it's good to mention that those people were labeled as traitors. It was some sort of a punishment for Crimean population for apparently supporting the German troops.
That was the reason they had to be punished.
Punished the whole nation. So they wanted to wipe out the whole history of Crimean Tatars. For example, the cemeteries, the stones, they were used for roads.
Around 200,000 Crimean Tatars were expelled within days from their homes by Stalin and relocated thousands of kilometers away, mostly in Central Asia. For its scale, it was a lightning-fast operation. For those who survived the journey, the trauma remained for the rest of their lives.
My grandma, she was moved when she was 4. She came back in 1989. She went back to her family house and she saw other people living there, obviously, and they didn't allow her to go in. I could see that pain on her face and that there is still this little child inside of her that suffered through so many things. The Second World War, the deportation, the death of so many people, I mean, she witnessed it. And then an adult woman comes back to see her family house and it's occupied by someone else.
The Crimean Tatars were only allowed to return to their homeland in the late 1980s. In the meantime, the peninsula changed hands, sort of.
Crimea was part of Russia for several centuries, until the key year of 1954, when Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader at the time, gave Crimea to Ukraine, which of course was not a big deal because both Ukraine and Russia were part of the Soviet Union. But when the USSR collapsed, Crimea ended up as part of independent Ukraine, which Russia recognized. It recognized Ukraine's borders, including Crimea.
Ukraine declared its independence in 1991. Fast forward a couple of decades, the developments that led to Crimea's next chapter caught many people unawares.
The events of March 2014 in Crimea, it was a bit of a shock. No one really saw this coming.
I don't think anyone in Ukraine expected that in the 21st century something like that could happen. So the annexation was virtually bloodless, and there was virtually no resistance from the Ukrainian military.
The events that took the world by surprise were accompanied by the appearance of some strange characters.
What we saw were these little green men, as they were called, unmarked servicemen appearing on the peninsula with weapons, patrolling the streets, occupying key infrastructure, communication centres. Russia denied having any knowledge, but they essentially occupied the territory. They were called vezhlivi lyudi, or polite people, because they were portrayed in the Russian media as being just there to help the local population, to protect them amidst all the chaos and turmoil that was happening in the rest of Ukraine.
A polite invasion, if there ever was one. But even though no one saw it coming, the dramatic events in Ukraine at the time provided Russia with an excuse to act.
In 2013, the then Ukrainian president turned his back on an association agreement with the European Union. For many years, Viktor Yanukovych had been playing off the West and Russia against each other, trying to get a better deal for himself and for Ukraine. Ultimately, Russia offered him a better deal, discounts on gas supplies, and he decided to turn his country back towards Moscow. This was really the trigger for the revolution in Kiev. People coming out onto the streets and Yanukovych to flee to Russia via Crimea. And then this led to the installation of a pro-Western government. Moscow wasn't best pleased.
The deadly Euromaidan protests, also known as the Revolution of Dignity, were a turning point in Ukraine's recent history. They showed the power of the people. Ukraine wanted to be part of the Western world and turned its back on Moscow. Russia's answer was swift.
Двух новых субъектов федерации – Республики Крым и города Севастополь.
In Moscow at the time, I saw slogans on the street saying Krym nash, Crimea is ours. It was very much the idea that this is just a correction of a historical injustice. This was Crimea coming home to its motherland. After the referendum, Crimea was incorporated into Russia, essentially. The stories we do see on state television coming out of Crimea are very positive. Life is rosy in Crimea.
Whether this is how Crimean residents felt it is a different question. The terms and conditions changed almost overnight, starting with identity papers.
They can't leave without the Russian documents now. So you need to have Russian citizenship to open a business, to go to uni, to go to the doctor. The first time I went in 2017 to the place I was born, but I was a tourist there. For them, I was a Ukrainian citizen visiting Crimea.
What were your impressions of how things have changed?
Russia is building roads and hospitals, but the hospitals right now are overwhelmed by the Russian soldiers that are fighting in Ukraine. Crimea, I thought it was going backwards because the freedom of speech was stolen, the freedom of travel was stolen. People cannot just go on plane and travel somewhere. People cannot talk openly about their beliefs.
We're talking about major changes. The education system changed, the media environment changed. Getting out of the region became so much more complicated.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. Given Crimea's historical connection with Russia, it seems it was easier to Russify compared to other places in Ukraine Russia later occupied.
People in Crimea were very nostalgic for the Soviet Union after it collapsed. It was remembered for stability, and that's what people were probably longing for at the time. Crimea was overwhelmingly Russian-speaking before the annexation. Teaching was in Russian, government meetings were in Russian, most of the media broadcast in Russian. And honestly, you would struggle to hear Ukrainian in the streets like ever. The changes after the annexation were not so much about increasing the share of Russian in public use. It was already close to 100%. But getting rid of everything Ukrainian, Russia introduced 3 official languages, Russian, Ukrainian, and Crimean Tatar, but that's on paper only. In fact, after 2022 especially, you could get in trouble for speaking Ukrainian in the streets, and Ukrainian is no longer studied at schools or universities.
Crimea really was, in some ways, ripe for Russification. There was already a significant Russian-speaking population. There was a huge military presence because of the Black Sea Fleet. There's also been repeated migration over the centuries of ethnic Russians. When Crimeans voted to join Russia in a disputed referendum, this paved the way for the absorption of Crimea into Russia. Very quickly, it was aligned with Russian legal systems, financial systems. We saw the ruble adopted as the currency. Education switched to a Russian curriculum away from a Ukrainian curriculum. Their population were also immediately considered to be Russian citizens. You need a Russian passport to access certain social benefits. You need a Russian passport to have property rights.
Crimea had already been Russified to a large extent. A few steps were required to seal the deal. There's a word for that which both Jen and I struggled to pronounce: passportization.
Passportizatsiya is a key tool in Russia's hybrid warfare playbook. It means simplifying the procedure for citizens of a third country to get a Russian passport. Tried and tested before in 2 breakaway regions of Georgia called South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Russia saw an opportunity to insert itself there, and Moscow also has a reason now to protect people living there.
How does that work in Crimea?
If you want to access pensions or social security payments, you need a Russian passport. Many jobs, you would need a Russian passport for it. It's designed essentially to make it very difficult for non-Russian passport holders to live in Crimea, which is the whole point. Ukrainians that did not want to take a Russian passport had a year to resolve their affairs, either sell up their land, sell up their property, or take a Russian passport.
The large-scale movement of people must have given Crimeans a sense of déjà vu. After all, how could they forget the grand Soviet social engineering projects that changed the region's demographics?
Lots of Crimean Tatars are afraid that the deportation that happened in 1944 can happen again, that they once may lose their houses, their lives again. Crimea is quite a popular destination now for the Russians who support Putin and his decisions. So lots of people are moving from cold provinces, and also lots of families of military men.
For now, it's not quite clear how big this movement of people is. The power in control, Russia, seems to be underplaying the numbers.
We've seen a lot of murkiness around the numbers. Russia doesn't necessarily want to advertise that it's enacting this policy of displacement, essentially. Russian banks have made it easier to get preferential mortgages. There's been a concerted effort to move people there.
Президент поставил задачу довести уровень жизни крымчан до общероссийского.
State media highlights the economic benefits that Crimeans are enjoying under Russian rule. It's all designed to populate it and insert Russia's sovereignty over that land.
The Russians are building apartment blocks. The locals that I talked to had the feeling that those apartment blocks are mostly for the newcomers. You can actually see so many websites telling you how to move to Crimea.
In accordance with the official Russian statistics, 240,000 Russians have moved into Crimea since its annexation. Ukraine actually says this number is much higher, around 800,000. Why Russia doesn't really want to make it easy to find out, because of the fact that forcibly changing the composition of a local population is in violation of the Geneva Conventions.
That explains why Moscow is so reluctant to reveal the true scale of the population movements. And how does the local population feel about this? Conquests, even if polite, take agency away from the people. And in the case of Crimea, their voice too.
We haven't had any independent opinion polls since 2014, and certainly not since 2022. From the Ukrainian side, we hear about oppression of Crimean Tatars and the pressure on independent media and any kind of dissent. If you want to find out what's really going on in Crimea, you would have to rely on some kind of anecdotal evidence and work hard to get it, because people in Crimea are cautious about what they say out loud.
There is zero freedom of speech. People are afraid to speak up, to talk on particular topics over their phones. They feel like they've been monitored all the time.
I would say those who had strong pro-Russian views at the time of the annexation, they still probably have them. But there are also other groups, maybe a majority, who don't really have strong pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian sentiments. They just want to live like a quiet, normal life. And when you accepted the annexation, they did not feel like it was something that they should be fighting against. But some of them, after the full-scale invasion, were not happy with Crimea being used as a staging ground for attacking Ukraine, where their friends and family may live. They're not okay with people being conscripted into the Russian army, returning from fighting in Ukraine as Russian soldiers, coming back dead. I would have to say that it's really hard to draw any kind of conclusions of what people there are thinking.
So the Russification of Crimea has meant Russians moving in, new passports for locals, those who don't want them squeezed out. We haven't yet spoken about the media, which plays a fundamental role in the Russian playbook of conquest. Yana can give us the before and after picture.
The media environment in Crimea before the annexation was, I would say, relatively diverse. It was obviously dominated by pro-Russian voices. But, for example, there was a very successful Crimean Tatar channel. There was a website doing high-profile journalistic investigations. There were bureaus of national media. After the annexation, the independent outlets tried to remain operational. But, of course, there was pressure from the new pro-Russian governments, security bodies, from the local militia, who could show up at your editorial office and tell you to leave. Pro-Ukrainian voices still exist, and there are media in Ukraine that cover Crimea, but they are based mostly in Kyiv. They do have contributors on the ground, but those contributors face a lot of danger. For example, there is a journalist who contributed to a Radio Liberty project covering Crimea, Vladislav Yesipenko. He was arrested in 2021, and he's actually still in jail.
It sounds like independent media in Crimea was exiled or suffocated, not unlike what's been happening in Russia in recent years.
This Crimean Tatar channel has a particularly interesting story. It actually tried to register as a Russian media outlet, which the media in Crimea had to do, but its application was rejected, and that's why the only choice that it had was to relocate to Kyiv, which is what it did.
Наш народ пережил Сталина. Неужели не переживет нынешние проблемы?
We can hear one of the editors of the channel signing off by saying, "Our people have survived under Stalin. We will get through today's challenges too."
Переживет и выживет.
To fill that gap, Moscow set up another TV station, a clone, if you like, of the Crimean Tatar channel that offered a different perspective.
They created this TV channel, which is a mixture of Russian and Crimean Tatar. And actually, some people are watching it, older generation, don't usually use social media or computers. So they just use the TV for the information. Actually, propaganda works. It completely changed their mindset, and they live with that hatred.
Yet it is the younger generation, the people of the future, that is the important target of the Kremlin's propaganda effort.
I was born and I grew up in freedom of speech, freedom of movement. But right now, kids, they live in very different circumstances. They are exposed to the Russian news, the Russian propaganda films. There was some program giving away money for those kids.
Привет, гражданин Российской Федерации. Ты уже слышал про Пушкинскую карту?
And I called Pushkin card. So you could use those credits on cinemas and theaters, but only for Russian-made films. So they would go and actually absorb the propaganda even more.
Ukraine has been trying to assert its own narrative with its own TV channel, Freedom TV. You can judge for yourself.
February 26 is the day of resistance to the occupation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Crimea was, is, and always will be Ukraine. Good afternoon.
Ukrainian government been saying a lot of propaganda in terms of giving the clear timeline when they're going to capture it back. So to give some hope to those people.
Ukraine clearly hasn't given up on getting Crimea back. But how feasible would that be? We end on a few sobering thoughts from our experts.
For 11 years now, there are so many new Crimeans that have never seen Ukraine in their lives. They don't speak Ukrainian, and they are exposed to the Russian popular culture and the Russian propaganda as well. Most of Crimeans have moved on.
We need to understand that Crimea is not a war zone like other regions in Ukraine. But of course, that doesn't mean that people are not asking questions. And the biggest question is, Russia promised stability and prosperity to Crimea. The main narrative was that we saved you from the chaos that you're seeing in Ukraine. You should be grateful to us. But it turns out that Russia did not bring stability or prosperity. It also brought war, and a lot of people are not happy about that.
Lots of pundits say that Ukraine won the war in Black Sea, but Russians got 20% of Ukrainian territory. It's slow, but they're moving forward.
Thank you to Jafer Umerov, Yana Lushnevskaya and Jen Monaghan for sharing their understanding of life in occupied Crimea. This is not the end of the story. In parts 2 and 3 of this series, we'll hear about the much harsher realities of Russian occupation in other parts of Ukraine. Thank you for listening from the Global Jigsaw podcast team, Krista Shattery and me, Krassi Twig. The sound engineer is John Hemingway. And we're always happy to hear from you. If we have prompted any questions or thoughts or experiences, please share them with us. Our email address is theglobaljigsaw, all one word, @bbc.co.uk.